So probably no surprise, my approach in life is very logical, very analytical, very rational. I try and find, objective truth in things. That's kind of my goal, at least what I aspire to. And, in doing that, when you're assessing things, when you're looking at things, you will try and identify those areas, or at least naturally it'll come up to you in those areas where something illogical is happening, right? When you're looking at a situation and you say, that doesn't meet the logical expectation of what I would expect to have happen there. Or as you start to think about the math, as we always talk about, you kind of calculate all the inputs. You say, I wouldn't expect that output. That doesn't seem to add up for me. Or that seems so unbelievably unlikely that it could play out that way. That becomes interesting, right? Anomalies like that, situations that play out that way for me become really intriguing and interesting, because if I don't suspect it's going to play out that way, it doesn't mean that, it's wrong or it's a lie. It certainly is possible, but I'd like to know why. I'd like to know what led to it happening in that way when I wouldn't have suspected it. So I look at those things, try and understand them better. Probably the biggest one that I see today, and maybe, for a long time, is how divided we are as a country. Now, that sounds almost cliched at this point. Like, yeah, of course, we're divided. We've always been divided. Why is that a story? Well, to me, it's true. We have always been divided, really since the beginning of time, even in passing the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, getting that ratified. There's always been disagreement, Federalist, Anti-Federalist, etc. But what's becomes the anomaly for me, what becomes the thing that seems too illogical to be true, is again the scope and how we're divided, the nature and the number of things we're divided on. It's almost absolute in nature that these two sides, by and large, liberals and conservatives, and obviously there's nuance to that, but that 50,000 foot view, you have these two sides and they seem to disagree on everything. Whatever the topic, wearing masks, not wearing masks, opening the schools, not opening the schools, trusting Dr. Fauci, not trusting Dr. Fauci. The riots in Portland and Seattle are out of control, and law and order needs to be brought back just to save the city. Or they're peaceful protests and fascist military agents are coming in and harassing them. It's just complete, utter disagreement, even on issues that should be scientific, that should be scientifically driven. Does this medicine work to treat coronavirus? People that have no idea that sit on either team are passing judgment on that and claiming to know the answer to it. Climate change is a perfect example. These are things that should be more objective, that somehow we disagree on. And again, we don't disagree in 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different ways. We disagree in 2 ways, 2 teams, 2 ways, and they almost see things completely differently, 180-degree view of it, and it's seemingly on all topics. I struggle to think of a topic where these 2 sides agree anymore. And you think about that historically, and you say, well, I don't think that's been the case, where it's been this divisive, where there's not a topic where there seems to be consensus. And that's what becomes interesting, right? What has changed? Have people changed? Has the country changed? Has the dynamic changed? What's allowed for it to become this extreme? And, there's all sorts of explanations for it. I won't claim to know the exact answer. But the one, it could just be true. It could just be the way we've evolved as a country and as a society, that we are just this divided now. It seems unlikely, though. It seems unlikely that we would be that clean and that neat. So it's possible that it's true, but I can't stop there. I need to think further about it. There's I at least have to explore that there's a more likely scenario. It could be a conspiracy theory. There could be some cabal that's pulling the strings and doing that type of thing. Maybe, right? It's certainly possible. And I get the idea that the likelihood in some small way perhaps is going up as you look at these events. But it's just because it's possible doesn't mean it's likely, right? So I like to follow the logic and the evidence and the data. And typically conspiracy theories like that, there's lots of holes in the logic. So it's possible. But again, I can't stop there. I need to keep looking and assume there might be another answer. So you start to wonder, like, where does that bring you? Where does it get you to? And it just feels like there are unique circumstances that are, I guess part of the reason you would think maybe there was a conspiracy involved is because they almost seem to be working in the perfect storm type way of preying on how the human minds work to lead to a belief or an assumption that perhaps isn't true. So let me say that in a non-kind of generic, cryptic way. It appears, the perception is that we are completely divided, right? So as an explanation to why that illogical thing, maybe it's not true. Maybe we aren't actually that divided, but it just appears that way. And you might say, oh, wait, we're going back to the conspiracy theory. Somebody's setting it up. No. I don't think it has to be a coordinated thing that's a conspiracy. I think there's just certain dynamics in our society, in our culture today, that allow for it. That again, whether it be intentional or not, I assume it's probably not. It just preys on these weak spots in our minds and how they work. So as an example, you take the media, right? You take the media and you say they're a for-profit business and their purpose is to make money and get clicks and build audience. And, this has been for a long time. The more dramatic you make it, the more emotionally driven, the more personal it feels, the more impassioned you get people, the more likely they're going to consume it. So that's been true for a long time, but I think it's grown, right? And it's continued. And the business behind it perhaps has grown in a more sophisticated way. The knowledge of how to do it effectively has evolved. And, you almost think of it, it's funny, I've said this to my wife before. She loves the show House Hunters on HGTV. And it's funny because when that show first started, however many years ago, it was set up in such a way where it's usually a couple that was looking to buy a house and they're looking at different options and they were generally aligned on what they wanted to buy. There might be a couple things they differed on, maybe somebody wanted a pool, somebody didn't. But as the show went on, it's almost as if the producers realized that, hey, we get a lot more views and people like it a lot better when the couple disagrees, when they want totally opposite things and it makes it like dramatic and exciting. To now, when you watch the show, every episode is like that. And every episode, they completely disagree on the type of house, old or new, big property, small property, they completely disagree. It almost feels like the media has just continued to progress through the seasons over the decades in the history of America and the world, and continuously move towards optimizing for that metric of getting people engaged and excited and making it interesting. So that's continued to improve. But then you add in maybe the biggest factor, which is social media. And you add in this new dynamic, which is so unnatural for how we think and communicate. And it sets itself up in a similar way, right? There's similar incentives to try and build the loudest voice to get the biggest audience and the most followers, right? So there's divisive views, there's extreme views on there. But it also, it makes it appear more representative than it is of the country in this case. You can have a mass movement on Twitter that's trending and, this Twitter mob is doing something, but it might be tens of thousands of people, which, feels like a lot on Twitter, but it's 330 million people in the country, so it's not representative. Similar thing on Facebook, right? You go on your feed and you have this kind of curated feed that's giving you things that's in somewhat of a bubble or an echo chamber. And it feels like it's representative. Like, everywhere I look, I'm seeing these stories of how much we disagree and how there's a total different view of opinion on if you should wear a mask or not, or whatever the topic. And it just reinforces this idea. And perhaps also a component to it is the coronavirus, because people have been locked up for so long. So some of these natural interactions you'd get being out and about with different people, exposing your mind to some different views, seeing it with your own eyes that, we're not disagreeing on everything. That's been shut down a little bit. So you don't have that reality check. You put all that together, and again, I don't think it's necessarily orchestrated, but all those things play into the idea of your mind consuming this information and trying to piece it into a cohesive narrative. And it's almost being pieced together for us, right? It works so much in lockstep because everybody's incentivized to draw an audience and draw eyeballs. And the way you do that is through drama and feeling like there's a lot of passion and emotion and fear and certainty involved. So that's what we see, that's what we consume. And much like we talk about individually when you're assessing something or trying to make a decision or having a conversation, almost as a society, we need to account for this, right? It's not that we need to assume somebody's intentionally tricking us, but we need to understand the potential flaws and blind spots we might have. We need to understand the inputs we're taking in and the flaws in those, and we just need to be realistic about it. And the concern is that perhaps we don't do that enough today. We're not stopping and stepping back and looking at it and recognizing the nature of this, right? The illogical nature of this. How could it be that we disagree on all these things? It just, it's a sanity check type thing where you step back and you say, it just doesn't seem likely. And you start to say, well, what's possibly happening here? Well, maybe if I don't look at what's trending on Twitter, right? Maybe if I don't look at what the news is telling me, but I try and get a more objective truth on it. I try and more directly get a sense of what's happening in a different way. Or at least I just question it more, right? I look for the facts more. How many people actually said that on Twitter? Which news station is actually reporting this, and what are they actually saying? And do I trust their history and the way in which they're reporting it? You ask those questions more, and I think you start to question more the reality of that assumption, that we're as divided as we think we are today. Because if we're not, which my presumption is that we're not, we just feel like it is, the perception is that it is, it's big implications. If we continue down a path of being led to believe that we're super divided, the actions we take, the repercussions to it could be huge. So I think it's important that we keep that in perspective. And when we see illogical things like this, you stay active, you stay aggressive with them. You try and understand them. You try and push yourself to question those types of things, and hopefully try and avoid some of these pitfalls that can happen when you get this perfect storm environment.